there is a moment, late in a large Philadelphia household, when a little girl was locked inside a closet by one of her own sisters. Instead of crying out, she simply sat down in the dark, pulled out her dolls, and quietly played by herself until someone finally let her out. That little girl would grow up to become one of the most photographed women on earth, a Hollywood legend who traded her career for a crown. But long before any of that, inside a strict, athletic family in Philadelphia, there was a mother who shaped four very different children and whose own story has almost never been told on its own terms. An immigrant's daughter who became an American original. Margaret Catherine Majer was born on December 13th, 1898, and much of her early life traces back to German immigrant roots, with her parents, Karl Majer and Margrethe Berg, having come from Germany before eventually settling in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Margaret grew up alongside two siblings in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood of the city, a working-class area that gave little indication of the extraordinary life that awaited her. Her family had been raised Lutheran, a detail that would later matter enormously once she fell in love with a young Irish Catholic athlete who would become her husband. Some accounts of her early years even trace her family's origins back to a small estate in Germany before their emigration, a detail that added an extra layer of old-world history to a family that otherwise built its American life from very modest beginnings. Even as a girl, Margaret displayed the kind of physical drive and competitive spirit that would define her entire life. She attended William Penn High School for Girls, where she was elected class president, and she went on to study at Temple University, where she became an outstanding intercollegiate swimmer. Her talent and discipline in athletics were unusual for a young woman of her era, at a time when organized sports for women were still viewed with skepticism by much of American society, and female athletes rarely received the same encouragement or institutional support that male athletes took for granted. Rather than treating her physical abilities as a passing hobby, Margaret pursued them seriously, eventually becoming the very first woman to coach women's athletic teams at the University of Pennsylvania, a genuine milestone for women in American collegiate sports during that period, and one that placed her at the forefront of a slow but meaningful shift in how women's athletics were regarded within American higher education. Margaret's striking looks did not go unnoticed either. During her younger years, she worked for a time as a model, appearing on magazine covers and building a public presence entirely separate from her athletic accomplishments. She was, by every account, a woman who refused to be defined by any single identity, someone equally comfortable coaching young athletes as she was posing for a photographer's lens. It was this same combination of discipline, beauty, and quiet determination that would eventually catch the eye of a brash, ambitious young rower from a working-class Irish Catholic family, a man whose own family history could not have looked more different from Margaret's, and whose pursuit of her would set the entire Kelly family story into motion. A 10-year courtship with an Olympic champion. The man who would become Margaret's husband was John Brendan Kelly, known to nearly everyone simply as Jack. 10 years older than Margaret and the son of Irish Catholic immigrants, Jack Kelly had grown up with a very different set of ambitions than Margaret's own family had instilled in her. He first met Margaret at a neighborhood swimming pool, and according to several accounts of the relationship, it took roughly a decade of persistent courtship before Margaret finally agreed to marry him, having reportedly led him through what one biographer described as something of a merry chase before finally consenting. By the time the two finally wed in January of 1924, Jack Kelly had already established himself as one of the finest rowers in the world, winning an Olympic gold medal in single sculls at the 1920 Antwerp Games, a victory that carried an especially satisfying edge for him personally, since he had previously been barred from competing in the prestigious Diamond Sculls race at Henley in England, reportedly due to rules that discriminated against manual labourers like the bricklayers in his own family's trade. Rather than allowing that rejection to define him, Jack used it as motivation, and his Olympic triumph became a defining moment in both his athletic career and his emerging public reputation back home in Philadelphia. He would go on to build considerable wealth through his own construction business, eventually parlaying his bricklaying background into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and he later ventured into local politics as well, serving briefly as Pennsylvania's Secretary of Revenue and mounting an unsuccessful bid for mayor of Philadelphia in 1935, a campaign that Margaret herself reportedly played a quiet but influential role in discouraging him from repeating when he later considered running for the United States Senate. For the marriage to happen at all, Margaret needed to make a significant personal decision of her own. Raised in a Lutheran household, she chose to convert to Catholicism ahead of the wedding, aligning herself with her husband's faith and, in many ways, with the entire Irish Catholic world he came from, one built around family, church, and fierce athletic ambition. It was the first of many adjustments Margaret would make throughout her marriage, choices that consistently placed her family's needs and her husband's expectations ahead of her own individual path, even as she continued pursuing her own professional interests on the side. Friends of the couple later noted that Margaret rarely spoke of the conversion as any kind of sacrifice, treating it instead as simply one more practical step toward the life she had chosen to build with Jack. In much the same disciplined, matter-of-fact way she approached nearly everything else in her life. What neither of them could have known on their wedding day was just how large, complicated, and ultimately famous the family they were about to build together would eventually become, starting with the arrival of 4 children across less than a single decade. 4 children, 4 very different paths. Between 1925 and 1933, Margaret gave birth to 4 children in relatively quick succession, each of whom would go on to lead a remarkably distinct life. Their eldest child, a daughter named Margaret Catherine, arrived first in 1925 and would be known throughout her life simply as Peggy. 2 years later, in 1927, their only son arrived, John Brendan Kelly Jr., who would come to be called Kell by nearly everyone in the family. Then, in November of 1929, their third child was born, a daughter named Grace Patricia, whose life would eventually take a path that none of them could have imagined at the time. Finally, in 1933, their youngest child arrived, a daughter named Elizabeth Ann, known to the family as Lizanne. Growing up in the Kelly household in the East Falls section of Philadelphia meant growing up in an environment defined almost entirely by physical achievement and gregarious extroversion, qualities embodied fully by Jack Kelly Sr. himself. He expected his children to match his own athletic drive and outgoing personality, and by most accounts, 3 of his 4 children largely lived up to those expectations in their own ways. Peggy, the eldest, was witty, socially confident, and quickly became her father's clear favorite among the 4 children. Kell, the only son, was steered from a very young age toward a serious rowing career, eventually being groomed specifically with the goal of winning at Henley, following directly in his father's athletic footsteps, whether or not he felt any particular passion for the sport himself in those early years. Lizanne, the youngest, grew into what family members later described as the pampered baby of the household, doted on in ways her older siblings had not always experienced in quite the same manner, benefiting from being the last child at a point when her parents had perhaps softened somewhat after raising 3 children already. The family split its time between their primary home in East Falls and a beach house the Kellys built in Ocean City, New Jersey, a modest coastal retreat that became a beloved gathering place for the extended family throughout the summer months for decades. It was there, along the Jersey shore, that the 4 Kelly children spent countless summers swimming, playing tennis, and competing against one another in the kind of good-natured but intense sibling rivalry that defined so much of their shared childhood. A rivalry that extended even into their teenage years, with the siblings famously sneaking off to nightclubs together and covering for one another whenever one of them managed to slip past an unsuspecting doorman. Then there was Grace, the third child, who from an early age simply did not fit the mold that the rest of her boisterous, athletic family seemed to occupy so naturally. She was quieter, more introverted, and dealt with health issues in childhood, including asthma and sinus problems, that further set her apart from her more robust siblings. It was a difference that would come to define much of her childhood experience within the family, and it set the stage for a complicated relationship between Grace and her parents that would take decades to fully resolve, one that stood in sharp contrast to the way her mother related to the other three children in the household. The overlooked child in a house full of athletes. Within the competitive, physically driven atmosphere of the Kelly household, young Grace increasingly found herself on the outside looking in. Her father's blunt disappointment in his third child's more delicate temperament was, by multiple accounts, expressed openly rather than kept private. He was reportedly heard to remark dismissively about Grace's tendency toward quiet, emotional moments, treating her sensitivity as a source of mild irritation rather than something requiring gentleness or understanding. Whatever warmth existed between Grace and her father during these early years, it never seemed to match the easy, natural connection he shared with his favorite daughter Peggy, or the ambitious athletic partnership he had cultivated with his only son. That closet incident, in which one of her own sisters shut her inside for a period of hours, captures something essential about Grace's position within her own family during those years. Rather than fighting back or making a scene, by most accounts, she simply settled in and quietly entertained herself with her dolls until someone eventually came looking for her. A small but telling glimpse into the kind of self-contained, undemanding child she had already learned to become inside a household that did not always make room for her particular temperament. It was a pattern of quiet self-sufficiency that would follow her well into adulthood, long after she had left her parents' house behind for the bright lights of New York and eventually Hollywood. Grace herself later reflected on just how competitive her childhood home had felt, describing an environment in which all four children found themselves constantly vying for their parents' attention and affection, since neither Jack nor Margaret handed out approval particularly freely. Her father's favoritism toward Peggy was reportedly not even something he tried especially hard to disguise. At one point, telling a reporter directly that whatever Grace could accomplish, her older sister Peggy could always do better. For a sensitive child already struggling to find her footing within such an intensely competitive family dynamic, hearing that kind of comparison stated so plainly must have been enormously difficult to absorb, especially given how frequently such remarks seemed to surface, whether at home among family or, as in this case, in front of members of the press. Margaret's own approach to parenting differed considerably from her husband's more openly expressive style, though it was not necessarily any gentler in practice. Even though she was fully aware of her husband's repeated infidelities throughout their marriage, Margaret rarely allowed her private pain to surface in front of her children, maintaining an outward composure that some who studied the family later described as emotionally controlled, almost to a fault. She loved her four children deeply, but she was not naturally inclined toward physical affection or overt displays of warmth. Instead, discipline became her primary language of love, a structured, orderly approach to raising her children that left comparatively little room for the kind of open emotional comfort a more sensitive child like Grace may have needed most. Family members who observed the household over the years often noted that Margaret ran her home with the same kind of exacting standards she had once applied to coaching young athletes, expecting order, punctuality, and self-control from her children. rather than offering the softer reassurances that a more naturally affectionate parent might have provided. It would take many years, well into Grace's adulthood, before she and her mother would finally begin to develop the kind of close, genuine relationship that had eluded them during Grace's difficult childhood years, a reconciliation that arrived only after Grace had already begun charting an entirely unexpected path of her own, one her parents initially found almost impossible to accept. An actress in a family that wanted athletes. By the time Grace reached adulthood, she had decided she wanted to pursue acting, a career path that immediately put her at odds with both of her parents' expectations for their children. Jack Kelly Sr. was reportedly blunt in his disapproval, at one point comparing the acting profession to something barely more respectable than street solicitation, a startlingly harsh assessment for a father to level at his own daughter's chosen career. Rather than offering encouragement, both parents initially treated Grace's ambitions with open skepticism, viewing the entertainment industry as an unstable, faintly disreputable world entirely unsuited to a Kelly family daughter. It did not help matters that Grace's own uncle, her father's brother, George Kelly, had already achieved considerable success as a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, a profession that had brought its own share of complications into the wider Kelly family's reputation, given the personal struggles George faced throughout his life. Grace pursued her training regardless, enrolling at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City, where she began developing the skills that would eventually make her one of the most celebrated actresses of her generation. She practiced relentlessly, reportedly recording her own voice and listening back to it in an effort to refine her delivery and shed any trace of the flat, nasal Philadelphia accent that might have held her back in front of casting directors. During this period, she also entered into a romantic relationship with one of her acting instructors, a man who happened to already be married at the time. When she brought him home to meet her parents, her father reportedly responded with outright laughter at the instructor's confident prediction that Grace would one day become a genuine star, treating the entire scenario as something closer to a joke than a serious possibility. Once Margaret discovered that the man was married, the relationship was quickly ended, only to briefly resume again later, at which point Grace's parents intervened once more to bring it to a definitive close. Despite her family's early resistance, Grace's talent and determination eventually carried her to extraordinary heights. She built a genuinely remarkable film career throughout the early to mid-1950s, working alongside some of the biggest leading men in Hollywood, including Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, James Stewart, Cary Grant, and Bing Crosby, and collaborating memorably with director Alfred Hitchcock across 3 separate suspense thrillers. Her range extended from tense westerns to romantic comedies to psychological dramas, and by the mid-1950s, she had become one of the most sought-after leading ladies in the entire industry, eventually winning an Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in a 1954 drama, a full vindication of the career path her own parents had once dismissed so completely. Yet just as her career reached its absolute peak, an entirely different kind of opportunity arrived, one that would take Grace even further from the world her parents had originally wanted for her, and would ultimately transform their entire family's public profile in ways none of them could have anticipated. From movie star to princess, and a mother's changing role. In the spring of 1955, Grace traveled to the French Riviera for a photo assignment tied to the Cannes Film Festival, and it was there that she was introduced to Prince Rainier III of Monaco. At the time, Grace was actually seeing someone else, a French actor she had been dating, though that relationship soon faded into the background as her correspondence with the prince deepened over the following months. What followed was a largely long-distance courtship conducted primarily through letters exchanged across the Atlantic, culminating in a marriage proposal delivered over the Christmas holiday in 1955. Fittingly enough, right there inside the Kelly family's own home in East Falls, Philadelphia, where Rainier had traveled specifically to meet Grace's parents and formally ask for her hand. Their engagement was formally announced in January of 1956 at a crowded press conference held at the Philadelphia Country Club, instantly transforming what had already been a notable Hollywood career into one of the most significant royal romance stories of the entire 20th century. For Margaret, her daughter's engagement to a reigning European prince represented an enormous and unexpected shift in her role as a mother. She had spent decades navigating a household defined by athletic competition and her husband's larger-than-life personality. And suddenly, she found herself thrust into the position of mother of the bride for what would become one of the most closely watched weddings of the era. Reporters and photographers descended on the Kelly family home in the weeks leading up to the wedding, eager for any small detail about the American movie star who was about to become a genuine European princess. And Margaret found herself navigating a level of press attention that dwarfed anything the family had previously experienced, even during the years when her husband had run for public office. The ceremony itself took place across 2 days in April of 1956, beginning with a 16-minute civil ceremony inside the Prince's Palace of Monaco on April 18th, attended by a formal recitation of the more than 100 official titles Grace acquired through the marriage, followed the next day by a grand religious wedding at St. Nicholas Cathedral, an event that drew enormous global press attention and effectively marked the end of Grace's film career, since she chose to fully embrace her new role as Princess of Monaco rather than continue acting. Thousands of Monegasque citizens attended the reception that followed, and the wedding was broadcast and photographed for audiences around the entire world. A spectacle that made Grace's transformation from Hollywood star to European royalty feel almost like something out of one of her own films. Newspapers at the time frequently described it as the wedding of the century, and for a family that had once dismissed acting as barely respectable, the sheer scale of the ceremony must have felt like an almost dizzying confirmation of just how far their once overlooked third daughter had travelled. It was in the years that followed the wedding that Margaret and Grace's relationship finally began to deepen, in ways it never quite had during Grace's childhood. Distance, ironically, seemed to soften whatever tension had once existed between mother and daughter, and Margaret made regular trips to Monaco throughout the following years, including travelling there in January of 1957 to be close to Grace for the birth of her first child, Caroline. Margaret would return again for the births of Grace's 2 other children, Albert and Stephanie, gradually becoming a steady and familiar presence in her daughter's new life, one that stood in marked contrast to the emotional distance that had characterized so much of Grace's own upbringing. The woman who had once struggled to offer her third daughter the warmth she seemed to need most as a child gradually became, in her later years, one of the steadier and more supportive figures in Grace's new, extraordinarily public life as a European princess. But even as that particular relationship healed, tragedy and loss were quietly accumulating elsewhere within the Kelly family, beginning with the son who had once been groomed from childhood to become the family's next great athletic champion. Kell's Olympic legacy and a sudden ending. John B. Kelly Jr., known throughout his life as Kell, followed directly in his father's rowing footsteps, competing in 4 separate Olympic Games across his athletic career, beginning at the 1948 London Games and continuing through 1952, 1956, and finally 1960, and winning a bronze medal in single sculls at the 1956 Melbourne Olympics. In 1947, he received the James E. Sullivan Award, given annually to the top amateur athlete in the entire United States, an honor that validated all the years of training his father had pushed him through since childhood, and one that only one other Philadelphia rower has ever managed to win in the sport's history. He went on to win the prestigious Diamond Sculls race at the Henley Royal Regatta not once but twice, in both 1947 and 1949, finally accomplishing the very feat his father had once been denied the chance to attempt. A poetic bit of family redemption that meant a great deal to both men. Beyond his own competitive rowing career, Kell went on to take over leadership of the family's bricklaying business following his father's death in 1960, eventually building it into the largest masonry contracting firm in the entire northeastern United States, all while continuing his deep involvement in amateur athletics on the side. Kell's ambitions extended well beyond business and athletics, however. He served 12 years on the Philadelphia City Council as an at-large member, and he became a passionate and often outspoken advocate for amateur athletes throughout the country, eventually serving as president of the Amateur Athletic Union in 1970, where he pushed for reforms to what he viewed as an outdated and unfair amateur sports code that had long restricted athletes from earning any income connected to their sport. His personal life also drew occasional public attention, including a well-publicized relationship in the mid-1970s that became a subject of controversy during one of his political campaigns, along with 2 marriages over the course of his life, the second of which lasted until his death. His dedication to athletics and public service eventually culminated in February of 1985, when he was elected president of the United States Olympic Committee, a fitting capstone to a lifetime spent immersed in the world of competitive sport that his own father had first introduced him to as a boy. Colleagues who worked alongside Kell throughout his decades of involvement in amateur sports often described him as a tireless advocate who genuinely believed in expanding opportunities for athletes who lacked the wealth and connections that had made his own path through the sport considerably smoother than it was for many others. Tragically, Kell would hold that prestigious position for barely 3 weeks. On the morning of March 2nd, 1985, following his usual morning row along the Schuylkill River, Kell suffered a sudden and fatal heart attack while jogging back toward his athletic club in Philadelphia. He was only 57 years old, a shockingly young age for a man who had spent his entire life devoted to physical fitness and competitive athletics, the very picture of health right up until the moment his heart gave out on a street he had jogged countless times before. In an extraordinary and deeply strange coincidence, Eugene Conlon, the former husband of Kell's own sister Peggy, collapsed and died of a heart attack of his own that same day, just several blocks away from where Kell had been stricken. An eerie parallel tragedy that medical examiners at the time attributed to nothing more than pure coincidence, despite how unsettling the timing appeared to family members trying to process 2 devastating losses within the very same afternoon. For Margaret, who was still alive at the time and had already endured her husband's death 25 years earlier, and her daughter Grace's shocking loss just 3 years before, the sudden death of her only son represented yet another devastating blow in what was becoming an unusually difficult stretch of family tragedy, one that had already begun with an entirely different and far more publicly mourned loss just a few years earlier. The accident that shocked the world. On September 13th, 1982, Grace was driving from the family's country home back toward the palace in Monaco, with her younger daughter Stephanie in the passenger seat beside her, when she suffered a small stroke behind the wheel. Losing control of the vehicle, the car went off the winding mountain road and tumbled down a steep hillside. Stephanie, though badly shaken, tried desperately to grab the wheel and regain control before the car went over the edge, and though she survived the crash, she suffered her own injuries and would carry the emotional weight of that day for the rest of her life. Grace suffered far more severe injuries, including trauma to her brain and chest, along with a broken leg. She was rushed to the hospital that would eventually be named in her honor, but her injuries proved too severe to overcome, and after doctors determined that recovery was not possible, the difficult decision was made to let her go. She passed away the following evening, September 14th, 1982, at the age of 52. The news of Grace's death sent shockwaves around the entire world, given her enormous and enduring fame both as a Hollywood legend and as a beloved European royal figure. Her funeral, held just days later at the same cathedral where she had married Prince Rainier more than a quarter century earlier, drew an extraordinary gathering of world leaders, entertainment figures, and ordinary admirers who had followed her remarkable journey from Philadelphia to Hollywood to the Mediterranean coast of Monaco. For her mother, Margaret, then 83 years old, the loss of her third child represented an almost unimaginable grief, made only more painful by the fact that Margaret's own relationship with Grace had grown so much closer and warmer in the decades following her daughter's marriage, after so many years of distance and misunderstanding during Grace's difficult childhood. Margaret had lived to see her once overlooked daughter transform into one of the most beloved and respected women in the entire world, only to lose her so suddenly and so young, a loss made all the more painful by how hard-won that closeness between mother and daughter had ultimately been. The years that followed brought Margaret an almost unbearable accumulation of loss. Her husband had died in 1960. Her daughter Grace died in 1982. Her only son, Kell, followed just 3 years later in 1985. And within that same brutal decade, Margaret herself began experiencing a series of strokes that gradually eroded her own health, eventually requiring her to move into a convalescent care facility in New Jersey. It was there, after years of declining health, that Margaret's own long and remarkable life would finally reach its own quiet conclusion, closing out an extraordinary story that had begun in working-class Philadelphia and stretched all the way to a European royal court and back again. Margaret's final years and the family she left behind. Following her husband's death and the loss of 2 of her 4 children within just a few years of each other, Margaret Majer Kelly spent her final years living quietly at the Linwood Convalescent Center in New Jersey, having entered the facility around 1982 as her health began to seriously decline. She suffered several strokes during this period, gradually losing more and more of the vigor and physical strength that had defined so much of her earlier life as a championship swimmer and pioneering women's athletics coach. Visitors during those later years often remarked on how much the once vigorous, disciplined matriarch had changed, though family members who came to see her noted that her sense of composure, the same quiet self-control that had defined her entire adult life, seemed to remain with her even as her physical health continued to fail. On January 6, 1990, Margaret died of pneumonia at the convalescent center at the remarkable age of 91, having outlived her husband by 3 decades and having endured the loss of 2 of her own children in her final years. Margaret's obituaries at the time consistently noted her own genuine accomplishments, describing a woman recognized both for her individual achievements in athletics and modeling, and for the extraordinary family she had helped raise, one that included an Olympic athlete son, a princess daughter beloved around the entire world, and 2 other daughters who, while less publicly known, lived rich and full lives of their own within the tight-knit Kelly family circle. Beyond raising her children, Margaret had remained civically active for decades, particularly through her long association with the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, where she served on its board and eventually chaired its development program, work significant enough that a section of the college's hospital was later named in her honor, along with an honorary Doctor of Letters degree recognizing her contributions. Of her 4 children, only her youngest daughter, Lizanne, would survive Margaret by any significant length of time. Peggy, the once favored eldest daughter, passed away in November of 1991 just under 2 years after her mother, following a long illness at the age of 65, having outlived two marriages of her own along the way. Those who knew her in her later years often remarked that Peggy had remained every bit as witty and socially engaging as she had been as a young woman, still regarded by many in Philadelphia as remarkably attractive well into middle age, even if she never achieved anything close to her younger sister's international fame. That left Lisanne as the last surviving Kelly sibling for nearly 2 more decades, carrying the family's memory forward alone until her own death in November of 2009, by which point she had endured further personal tragedy of her own, including the loss of her only daughter to illness in 1999 and her husband's death the following year. In her later years, Lisanne found some comfort in simple pleasures, spending time at the racetrack in Florida, playing tennis and golf, and staying close with her son and grandchildren, a quieter kind of contentment after so many years of watching her siblings and parents pass on ahead of her. When Lisanne finally passed away, the entire generation of children Margaret and Jack Kelly had raised together in that bustling East Falls household had come to its own quiet close, leaving behind a legacy carried forward through grandchildren scattered between Philadelphia and the royal family of Monaco. The family that bridged two worlds. Looking back across the full arc of Margaret Majer Kelly's life, what emerges is a story considerably more layered than the brief mentions she typically receives as simply the mother of a famous princess. She was, in her own right, a genuine trailblazer in women's collegiate athletics, a woman who converted her entire religious identity for love, who raised 4 children inside a demanding and highly competitive household, and who ultimately outlived her husband and 2 of her own children, enduring a level of personal loss that would test anyone's resilience. Her relationship with her daughter Grace, in particular, tells a story that resists easy simplification. A mother and daughter who struggled to connect during the daughter's difficult childhood years, only to finally build something genuinely close and meaningful. Once that daughter had grown into an adult, living an entirely different, unimaginable kind of life, an ocean away. It is a reminder that family relationships rarely follow a single, simple arc from beginning to end, and that even the most complicated childhoods can, given enough time and enough willingness on both sides, eventually give way to something warmer and more genuine. The 4 Kelly children, meanwhile, each carried forward different pieces of the household Margaret and Jack built together. Peggy embodied the outgoing confidence and social ease her father had always valued most, remaining a beloved figure within her own Philadelphia social circles for the whole of her life. Kell channeled his father's athletic ambition into an Olympic career and decades of public service before his own sudden and premature death cut short what might have been an even longer, more influential chapter in American amateur sports administration. Grace transformed her early childhood sense of being overlooked into one of the most celebrated careers in Hollywood history, before an entirely unexpected romance carried her into a royal life that reshaped her family's story forever, turning a girl once dismissed as delicate into one of the most admired women of her century. And Lisanne, the youngest and most pampered of the 4, ultimately became the last one left to carry her family's memory forward alone, watching her siblings and both of her parents pass on ahead of her across 3 difficult decades, finding whatever quiet peace she could in the smaller pleasures life still offered her. What remains today is the story of an ordinary Philadelphia family that found itself extraordinarily transformed by fate, talent, and a chance meeting on the French Riviera, all traced back to a determined young swimmer from a modest German immigrant household who spent a decade being courted by a stubborn Irish-American Olympic champion before finally agreeing to become his wife. Their 4 children scattered across sports, business, politics, film, and eventually European royalty. Yet the woman at the center of it all, quietly disciplined and rarely given credit in her own right, remained the steady thread connecting all of their very different lives back to that same modest brick house in East Falls, where it had all begun. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.